All right, well, I'm going to talk about how to work with data that's in external data sources, data that pre-exists in some kind of database, and how to bring it into LabKey and what you can do with it once you've got it inside of LabKey. So I've really got three topics on my agenda here. First, just talk about the use cases. Like, when would you want to use or connect to an external data source from LabKey? And then second, I want to really show you how to do it. Like, how do you make that connection and load that data from external databases? And then third, take a look at reporting on such data, because there are some sort of special concerns around how to do that. Just to kind of make this topic a little bit more vivid, I'm talking about how to connect the server to these kinds of mechanisms, databases like Postgres, Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server, etc. These are systems that hold data in a structured way. They're database systems, and LabKey is pretty good at database data, and it's great at connecting to these systems. So that's what I'm talking about. LabKey is really built on top of database data. It must in fact be it must in fact have either a Postgres or a Microsoft SQL Server database to live on. But it's not just limited to those. LabKey can also connect to any number of external database systems, and that's what I'm talking about, is extending the reach of the server into those other database systems. In fact, there's 6 such systems we support. Postgres, you can connect to a second Postgres database if your server already lives on top of one. We also support Microsoft SQL Server, MySQL, Oracle, SAS, and Redshift, which is relatively recent. We just introduced Redshift support really in the last, couple of months, couple of years. So when would you want to do this? What kind of problems does this kind of technique solve? Well, I think there's lots of possible use cases, but the first thing that comes to mind is building a single point of access when you have kind of heterogeneous data sources. And I'm thinking here of, sometimes people call these like data marts or data warehouses. This is a use case where, say, you've got some data in an Oracle system and you've got some data in a Postgres system, and you want those data to sort of come together and talk to one another and create dashboards on those, or just make them available to people in a single point of access. Connecting with these, connecting via the external schema connections is a great way to pull this off. Another use case that we often see with our clients is leveraging legacy systems. They've got some kind of maybe an aging database or something that they want to pull the data out of, and migrate out of it. This can be just a one-time thing, like they plan to retire that system and they want to migrate the data into something else. That's one use case that we see a lot. But it doesn't need to be just a one-time migration. It could also be sort of an ongoing synchronization. Maybe you want that database system to live on. You don't really plan on retiring it. It's something that's vital and you want to keep going. We'll call this kind of the ongoing synchronization use case. And I'm thinking of, we've seen this with clients who have, say, medical records or patient records that are ongoing. They're changing, they're being added to over time, but they want to use LabKey as a reporting mechanism on top of those systems. Another use case we see is, other applications or web applications, say like benchling. Benchling is backed by a database, and users often want to pull, but benchling isn't everything. It's got limitations, and LabKey has many strengths that sort of can be used to amend the benchling application. So many of our users have connected to the backend database that's underneath benchling and pulled that data into LabKey. So now you really have, if you like, two systems sitting on top of common data, and you kind of get the best of both worlds out of such a system. I think we've seen people do that with Epic or Emulga, if my memory serves correctly, and we've also seen them do that with benchling. And I'm sure there's lots of other systems that I haven't heard about. And in general, I think anytime you want LabKey to see some data that's already in a database, but not necessarily change that data, this is a great mechanism to use. It's one of its great advantages is that it's a direct connection to the data. It's not some like tenuous import process that's error prone or maybe uses user manual input. Not at all. This is a direct connection to a database. You're really just surfacing database data in LabKey using this mechanism, and so it's very powerful. And I should say, and then also, it's not just these connections to external data are not just read-only connections. They can also be read and write connections. So you could also use this mechanism when you want LabKey, anytime you want LabKey to really take over the stewardship of some data in a database. And again, I'm really just restating here the use cases where you want to like retire a legacy system and have LabKey take over that data, and make LabKey the new database of record for such data. I'm sure there's lots of other use cases out there. Matt or any other developers just have anything to add here? These are just kind of the first thoughts that came off the top of my head for this kind of use cases.
I think you did a pretty good job of covering the kinds of uses.
Good.
It's hard in these kind of wide webinars. I would love to hear examples, usages from our customers, but maybe that'll come up in the Q&A.
Yeah, I've got some projects, some particular client projects, and that I can talk about later. They're coming up. All right. Another thing that I wanted to definitely highlight here, when you use this mechanism of connecting to an external database, almost all of the LabKey features come into play. There's too much to say here because the LabKey features are so rich, but I thought I wanted to really drive home the fact that such data really becomes LabKeyified. It's LabKey data now. And all of the wonderful features that you're used to all of a sudden can be applied to this data. So first thing that comes to mind, data that you've attached to, that you've brought in from an external data source, it becomes available on the web. I think this is really powerful. Like, your data used to be locked up in some lonely database that no one knew about. And as soon as you just make the connection, it's available on the web, surfaced in a browser. We sort of take this for granted. It seems so trivial, but it's not trivial at all. This is really, really powerful. You can all of a sudden send a URL to somebody and say, look at the data. Second, all the power around LabKey data grids gets applied to this data. the filtering, the sorting, the morphing, the kind of the plasticity you get in a LabKey data grid, all the metadata you can apply through a LabKey data grid, et cetera, et cetera. Querying. This is a very profound feature in LabKey. There's just so many features to LabKey SQL queries. All of a sudden, this whole feature set becomes applied to the data, not least of which is the fact that this LabKey SQL, LabKey querying, is an abstraction layer on all of those different database implementations. You don't need to know anything about Oracle SQL dialect or Redshift SQL dialect. You only need to know one SQL dialect, LabKey SQL's dialect. You can speak that dialect to all these databases. It'll do the translation for you, and wonderful. Security. All of our security mechanisms apply to this data. Our role-based, our standard role-based security and folder-based security, and also PHI security can be applied to this data, and the other compliance features. All of our visualization and reporting mechanisms can be applied to this data. And I mean, like the standard charting mechanisms, our R mechanisms, etc. Also, the client API can work against this data, etc. So then, and I could just keep going. The whole LabKey feature set, I could just apply it all to this data. And actually, another call out to the devs here. Anything else that's exciting that we should mention here? It's just, I needed to stop at some point.
Yeah, well, one funny one is, of course, we support JDBC, so you can query your database now, except instead of going directly to the database, you're tunneling through LabKey, which means you can give your users JDBC access for whatever client you might have, but still enforce LabKey security.
That's great. Thanks a lot. That's great. It's a great point. Yeah, wonderful. Great. All right, well, let's keep going. Some notable projects that have used this technique. The 100,000 Genomes project made wide use of this technique. By the way, each one of these projects either has a case study article on labkey.com that you can read, or better yet, a user presentation from one of the user conferences. And so go to labkey.com and just really search for any of these projects, and you'll see those case studies or those user presentations come up. The 100,000 Genomes project really reached out to hundreds of different clinics, half a dozen other database-based data sources, and kludged it all together into this enormous data set that was then made available to scientists and patients and doctors and different portals. So this was just an enormous project that really relied heavily on external data sources. InZen, they recently gave a user presentation on their use of external data sources. They have a lot of their cell data inside of some data source, some database. I actually don't remember what the database is, but they have a very simple use case. It's kind of, if the Genomics England project is an enormous use case, the InZen use case is very simple. They just attach to this database and do some reporting on it, make some graphs on it. It's very simple. And in fact, I'm going to do a demo where I basically replicate that behavior. The Argos Hydra project also made heavy use of external data sources. If I recall correctly, they pulled in lots of patient data, pre-existing patient data. Really, I think there was like 300,000 patients and their medical histories that were pulled into LabKey and combined with other kinds of data and presented in a really slick web portal. And then Upside Foods recently gave a user presentation about their pipeline to bring in assay data from benchling. Well, actually, more than just assay data, cell line data, and all kinds of data from benchling, and how they were using that, using both LabKey and benchling together. So I actually have links behind all these. I don't know how to get these to you, but that for the moment, I recommend you just go to labkey.com and search for these, and you'll get those user presentations. Maybe Will and I can figure out a way to send you this slide deck or something to give you better access to it. Also, again, to the developers here, any other cool projects I'm missing here that we should shout out about? Well, if we think of any later, let's call them out. Well, let's move on to the second part of my agenda, which is just like, how do you do this? How do you set this up? Well, the good news is it's super easy. It's so easy. In fact, it's maybe the most powerful technique in the world of LabKey. If your criteria is a result to effort ratio, well, the result to effort ratio is very high here. You hardly have to do anything. And I wouldn't even really call it's hardly even technical. Like, there's just one little line of code which maybe you have to think about. It's just basically, though, just clicking through wizards to make this happen. There's really two steps to it. First, you need to tell Tomcat about the data source. That's the hard part, and it's not even hard. Second, you need to tell LabKey to load the data. That's it. And that second part is just a wizard. You just click buttons. It's nothing. So here's the only hard part right here. This is kind of how you configure Tomcat. You need to take this resource tag, kind of modify it a little bit, and drop it into your LabKey XML file, or get your IT support, your IT group to do this for you. Notice this is just boilerplate code. Is it even code? I don't even know. It's just boilerplate text, which we provide for you in the docs. So basically, really, to set this up, I just went to the docs, copied out this little stanza, this little resource tag, modified it where the red text is, and dropped it into LabKey XML file. That's it. And honestly, you probably know your username and password. That's not very hard to figure out. This red part, you maybe have to change this. What you have to do is actually point to your database here. That's the only part you have to do. Mine happened to be called external Steve, so that's what I put there. And then this PG bit in red, you don't really need to change that, but I wanted to highlight that because this actually, oddly enough, surfaces in the next part. This little PG surfaces in the wizard when you're doing the second part. So that's anyways, this is the first part. You're just modifying Tomcat with this little resource tag. That's it. It's the only hard part. Second part, you tell LabKey about this data. You tell it to suck it into a particular folder. And as you can see, it's just a wizard. You have to give you're basically introducing a new schema into the server. So you have to give that schema a name. You have to point to the actual data source. See that little PG right here on that dropdown? That's the PG from the little red text from the Tomcat tag. And then the rest of it, you need to decide, like, do you want it to be editable or to read only, etc. That's it. So again, I think this is my candidate for most powerful, easy technique available, because you really just open up a world of data for yourself here. I'm actually going to do this next. Let's actually do the demo. Anything you want me to add there, Matt, before I keep going here? Or Carl?
You're crushing it, Steve.
All right. All right. Smart. Okay. Well, let's actually do this. And, we're talking about data that's in a database that LabKey doesn't know anything about. And here is my data. It's buried down in this Postgres 12 database. And I've created a little database called External Steve. And it's got 3 schemas, public, which actually I think is that a system schema in Excel? I'm not sure. I mean, in Postgres, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So that's not really mine. There's repro 40828. This is some bug I had to test probably 4 years ago. So I don't even know what's in here, but it doesn't matter. And then I made this is the SQL. This was the schema I made called world. And it's got 3 tables. It's got a participant metadata table. And this is supposed to kind of, here's that table right here. This is supposed to be like a medical history table or some kind of patient data. So I made it really simple. I made it really easy on myself. It's a table which has a participant ID, a date of birth, medication, current medication column, a genotype column, just kind of some general patient metadata. There's a people table, which is just sort of a silly table of super simple table of people and people's first names and their ages, and then a things table, just a silly table of some things and their weight. Big deal. So, but let's use this participant metadata table. I think it's the most interesting one, most relevant to LabKey. Just kind of looking at this table, I'd like to visualize some things on it. I'd like to know, well, does the BMI score here, what's its relationship to the genotypes? Like, I'd like to do a visualization where I break out maybe the mean BMI score by genotype, or maybe do a graph of BMI by age. Is there any relationship there? Or look at the current medication column. Is there some relationship between medication and BMI? Don't know. Also, as you can see, this is clearly the kind of data that you might want to surface in a LabKey study as part of a larger effort. You maybe are collecting data on patients over time for some study, and this could be useful metadata in that study. You could find out, you could introduce into that study their current medication or their genotype and integrate it into the tables of that study. So I'm going to show you how to do both those things. By both those things, I mean visualize this itself, and then also take this data and integrate it into a LabKey study. So actually, let's just skip to the end. Let me show you what that looks like. I already did it. And let me just kind of skip to the end and show you that. Here is this very table. It's sitting surfaced in the LabKey UI. It's the very same data. It's not a copy of the data. It's the very same data. If I went and changed this data in Postgres and refreshed the page here, it would change, right? Because it's the same data. Here's some reports on that data. If I were to go and change this data in Postgres, this visualization would change. In fact, let's just do it. So let's say I'm going to just change this BMI value to something kind of outrageous, like change it from 28 to 280. And then save it in Postgres. Let's go see what happens to LabKey. Sure enough, there's that value right there, just changed. Sure enough, if I go to my report and refresh it, it's been ruined. There's that outlier data point. Well, that's just to want to make it really vivid for you how the data in Postgres is related to the data in LabKey. It's the same data. So let's go fix that data back. Pretty. So how did I do that? Well, let's go back to LabKey and let me just show you how I did it. First of all, I changed my LabKey XML file. I mean, I don't really want to show you that. It's just, I went into the LabKey XML file and dropped that resource tag into it. That's it. That surfaces all kinds of UI in LabKey, and that's what I really want to show you. Let's go to the query browser, because that's where it's first surfaces. Here is that schema. This is schemas in PG external Steve, ext Steve. That's what I've just surfaced. And there's that participant metadata table, et cetera, et cetera. I did it by, I achieved this through the schema administration panel. And basically what I did is I filled out this form. And I said, I want my data to be surfaced as a schema named ext_Steve or external Steve. I want to use the PG data source. That's me referring directly to that tomcat resource tag. And I wanted to point at the world schema. And there are those three tables that I can pick from. I decided to use them all. Notice by default, we make such external schema uneditable, just to be safe. But if I wanted to make it editable, I could. In this case, I think I'm not going to make it editable. I'll leave it to be a read-only thing. And in fact, there's a little bit more to this wizard too. Like there's this fast cache refresh. I actually don't really know exactly what this does, but it sounded cool, like it's something I wanted. So I said yes to it. I assume what this means is that it's checking, LabKey is checking Postgres for changes at a relatively quicker rate, which I wanted. So I said yes to it.
Yeah, I think it's not data changes because we're always querying the data. I believe it's checking that the shape of the table hasn't changed out from under us. Since we're controlling schema changes, we assume the shape of the table doesn't change until we,
Super, great.
Check again.
Yeah, great, thank you. And then there's also this area here to apply metadata to the table. If I were to use this, I would go over to my table info XML docs and do some copy and paste out of there to control how this table surfaced in the LabKey UI. That's kind of a hardcore way to do it, to use directly the XML. You can also achieve much the same thing using the graphical metadata editor. But this is just a very, very fundamental way to do it. You could actually add metadata here. And again, just to give you a little bit more vivid sense of what you can do with this window, metadata window, you can do things like change the labels of your columns. You can add URL properties to the columns. You could do even conditional formatting, really just all of the things that you can do in the field designer or the metadata designer in LabKey. I'm going to leave that blank because I prefer to use the graphical designer for that stuff. I just updated, well, I might as well just update this, why not? It's not going to break anything. And now I have my new schema surfaced in the LabKey schema browser and throughout the server. Just again, to drive it home, once this data is surfaced in LabKey, all of this stuff works. I can sort my data. I can filter it, et cetera, et cetera. I can apply all of my charting wizards to it. I can make R reports on it. I can export it. I can send the URL to somebody and say, hey, look at this cool data. It goes on up. And I can build these nice little dashboards on it. Now, I'm going on and on about how wonderful it is. There is one limitation that I know of on external schemas, and that is around kind of lookups and joins. You can't directly look up to data in an external database, in an external schema, and you cannot do SQL joins directly across the boundary between native LabKey data and external external data. So let's go back to the query browser. Notice there's really two major schema now in my folder. There's the native LabKey schema and all of its tables, and then my little schema, PG schema, and its view tables. I can't actually create a join that bridges this gap. If I want to make a join, I need to basically do one more little bit of data migration. I need to move data from my external schema into the native LabKey schema, into say a list or into study or something. And so that's kind of the major limitation of this technique, although it's hardly a major limitation. It's pretty easy to fix, pretty easy bridge to cross. And there's a number of ways to do it, but I decided to do it with a good old ETL. What I did is I set up a data, basically a data pipe between the participant metadata query here. And because I wanted to incorporate this into a study, I piped the data over to the study schema using an ETL. And I've done that in another project. I've done that here in my study. And I thought I'd give you a sense of how that works over here. Here's a study I'm working on. I'm just building up the data for it. I have a physical exam. That's all I've got. And this is a table that's not external. It's in the LabKey study schema. I entered the data through LabKey, and it's just ordinary LabKey data. It would be really nice, though, to take that external data, my participant metadata, and apply it here. I'd love to be able to see that data together. For instance, it'd be cool to see that genotype column here, or it'd be cool to see the BMI column. And you can see I've started to set it up here. I have a data set called participant metadata, but it's empty. There's no data loaded into it yet. Well, I can achieve it though. I can actually get the data from that external source into here with just two steps. First, I have to make the connection to the external data. I've already done that. You can see that in the query browser. Right here. There's my participant metadata. It's just waiting to be loaded. But because I wanted to make joins between the data, I needed to make a second step in the path. I needed to build an ETL that will actually move the data from ext_steve into study. And that's again, I don't want to get into it, but that's hardly any code. It's just boilerplate XML that I copied out of the docs and made a couple of changes to. That's all I did to create this ETL. I'm going to run it now. And now I should have two data sets in my study. I've got physical exam, which we saw, and now participant metadata got data in it. And now I can apply all of the magic of LabKey to this. Let's pull in those columns. Let's pull in that genotype column and that BMI column and this, why not this age column? There they are. This is my first hybrid grid in LabKey in this study. And I can do visualizations on all this now. Let's do a chart, say on, let's do mean blood pressure over BMI, over genotype. So now I'm about to build a chart where the x-axis came from that external data source and my y-axis came from my native LabKey data. Sure enough, I've got my first hybrid visualization in LabKey. So hope this gives you a sense for the power of this feature and how easy it really is to pull off the magic here. Questions out there? Well, I'm going to lead my own Q&A session here. Let me look. I've got a couple of questions here. Where would you, one of the user asks here, where would you edit the schema? Is it in Tomcat? And I think, if I get your question, I think, where would I edit the schema? Well, actually, if I could edit it just in Postgres itself, like through their PG admin here, or I could also edit it in LabKey. If I make the schema editable in LabKey, I actually have full control over it. I can add columns, delete columns, I can add data, delete data. It's just kind of becomes LabKey data.
That's not, you can't change the schema from within the LabKey user interface.
Oh, I can't add columns?
No, I mean, it's even like module query schemas, you can't change, you can only change schemas for lists and data sets and sample sets, right? You can't change them for any table. But Adam actually added, I don't know what, 2 years ago or something, a very cool feature where you can use our module schema management scripts and have them work with external schemas.
Oh,
so we've developed over the years a mechanism for creating incremental scripts to modify schema as functionality in the product changes. And if you like that mechanism, you can, instead of changing your schema by hand remotely, through PG admin or something, you can create a little LabKey module that manages your schema updates.
Oh, that's great.
It's a nice feature.
That's great. Super. Thanks. That's why you're here, Matt. All right. Thank you for that. Another question. Are all of the steps that you do in the demo documented in LabKey? If so, can you kindly share the link? We do have docs on, obviously, building the little resource tags, and we do have docs on getting through that the wizard in the query browser. I don't really have docs on how I set up my demo, but all the elements are in the docs. Like basically I just did things like created a study and created an ETL. So kind of all the elements are there, but I don't have the whole narrative as a single item, I must say. Another question from a user here. Does the table get removed if the link is dead or offline? And if I understand your question right, do you mean if the connection between LabKey and the external database is severed or dies somehow, does the table get removed? I don't know. Actually, Matt, do you know offhand? I mean, we could just try it too.
It might depend whether it goes offline, like after LabKey is connected and seen the tables and thinks they're there, versus it never connected. It might act a little differently. Yeah. But if if LabKey connected and found these tables and they disappear out from under it, you would get some sort of configuration error. Please contact your administrator kind of error, I believe.
Yeah, right. Maybe if we have time, I could test that out and just. Although I don't know if I have a good way to test it out because I'm using Postgres I can't turn off my Postgres without destroying everything. So I
Right,
don't really have a great way to test it.
Right, it's two connections, but it's actually the same server you're talking.
Exactly. Yes, they kind of made it easy on myself. Another question is, hi, is it possible to import a selection of rows from a table? And yeah, I think it is. I think I can think of another ways to do it. I bet you could create a view.
Well,
inside a database.
ETLs, well, they're two different, he said import specifically.
Sure.
So in the, which I hear is copy. So in the copy case, you know, we don't actually copy directly from tables. We copy using a query over the table. So you can absolutely, you know, filter that data on import.
Yeah. Also,
No,
Also,
go ahead.
do you think, does the query metadata have a place for applying filters?
No,
Okay.
but like you said, you could create a view in the remote database, and that looks like a table to us.
Right.
Or, you know, now you get into linked filtered schemas, you know, you can connect your external database in one place called, you know, my external schemas in one folder, and then link out, use linked filtered schemas to expose subsets of that to different people.
Great. Those are great. Thank you. Those are great ideas. Super. Another question, where can we find the template that you showed before to connect to external databases? Yeah, let me show you that. That is, let me clear my own windows here. It's actually in the docs right here. And there's a topic called external schemas and data sources, and it's this section right here. We give links to all of these different flavors of resource tags. So there is the one for Microsoft SQL Server. There's the one for MySQL. And you basically just copy those out and modify them. We've put signaled the modifiable bits with these uppercase text elements here. And another user question, template was that chunk of code that you modified to connect to, oh, I'm sorry, that was just a continuation of the first question that got sort of broken up into two chunks. Great, and I see somebody else is kind of raising their hand. Could you enter your question in the Q&A there, please? Oh, yeah, here he is. Oh, interesting, he says, Steve, that Oracle template is old. Is it possible to use Excel? So apparently we could use some fixing up on the Oracle template. I'll take that as a to-do. Thanks for that. Another question here. Well, they keep coming. Is it possible to use Excel or KNIME and connect to LabKey? Matt, do you know about this at all?
Yes. So you can use our, I don't know which version of LabKey it is supported in, but we do have a JDBC and ODBC driver to talk to LabKey as if it itself were a SQL database. And you can use that for Excel, KNIME, or what's that, you know, the thing everyone loves, the guys over in Fremont.
Tableau.
Tableau, thank you. Yeah, so that is a great way to connect to external reporting services.
Yeah, the Tableau demo is really great to see.
Do you know what edition of LabKey supports the ODBC driver?
Yes. So you can also, like you mentioned, you can do a JDBC type of
connection. But it's not, I don't think it's in community is my point. I don't know which edition it is.
Right. I think that ODBC, I hate to say it without looking. I'm not sure either.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. But I do know that what we're showing today is in the community edition. So that's
Yeah.
another thing to keep in mind, that not only is this an incredibly powerful technique, it's in the community edition. It's amazing. And oh, also, are there docs for these things like the Tableau connection and stuff like that? Yes. And it's right here. It looks like ODBC is premium now that I'm here. But this is where you would start if you want to work with Tableau or Excel and pull data into those systems. Well, thanks again, everybody. If there aren't any other questions, Matt, do you have anything to add, or any of the devs here have anything to add before we sign off?